right, it's 12 o'clock, and welcome to this week's Owl Learning Farm Conservation webinar. Really excited to be hosting again today, and excited for the topic. Today we have Dr. Sylvie Brouder, that's a professor at Purdue University. Sylvie and I have had I've had the good fortune to work with Sylvie for a number of years on a nutrient drainage project. And so excited to hear her talk today about her work looking at network meta-analysis quantifies benefits of 4R and management. So we hear a lot about the 4Rs of nitrogen management. And I think Sylvie's done some great work trying to look at quantifying the benefits of that, really doing some good statistical approach. You know, some of us just average some things out, but Sylvie's really looking at it a lot more detailed than that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sylvie. As always, if you have questions, please type those in the chat box and we'll get those to Sylvie at the end of her talk. With that, the virtual floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Matt invited me to come talk on this topic, and then afterwards I was like, I'm not sure. This is a little bit maybe like statistically wonky, and it's about, how you make the cake, which may not be of the most interest versus the outcome or what you can see with this approach. But nonetheless, I thought I'd, go ahead and share what we've been trying to do and why. And hopefully I won't bore you too much with statistical details and hurt your head too much. This really comes out of a work that Jane Frankenberger has been leading, and it involves, she wrote me in to help with Indiana's science assessment for our nutrient reduction strategy. And I then, and Jim Cambarato here at Purdue was helping. I roped in my friendly statistician, Bruce Craig, because there's some tricky issues here, and I've been trying to learn how to deal with them. And then Katie Mazer at the time was the lucky individual who got to try to do the things we recommended she do. And it was a bit of a challenge, but just in terms of setting the stage. I mean, we all know the challenge of motivating voluntary changes in management. So, there's costs and risks and fears. And when we think about how to motivate change, we either want to subsidize the additional costs. The practice typically has been the approach. So I did a quick look to see what you could buy for cover crop seed on Amazon, and it just pops right up. There's an array of things you can buy there. From the insurance side, we typically think about the need to insure against yield losses. And when we're talking about something like nitrogen, for reasons both good or perhaps questionable, farmers are loath to lose any yield to a nitrogen issue. And in some cases, they would, in fact, perhaps prefer to lose a little bit of profitability to end over applications versus to a yield loss to insufficient N. In the past couple of years, we've been thinking about water quality and voluntary practices and what to do about that. But then along comes carbon as an issue that we want to motivate change on, and we want to motivate people to use practices that sequester carbon as a mitigation strategy. And the government was very heavily involved in driving that. But the difference in context here was really about the quantities and then the realization that climate smart agricultural practices, this broad group of practices that include N management practices, what they're targeting are things that we scientists are No, are small, slowly accruing, and highly variable effects. So if you want to see a change in soil carbon, now I think we'll all concede in general, you're waiting a while to see the impact of management. And the natural variability makes it hard to see the real change against the noise. And the same has always been true for looking at water quality impacts. So, we had a conference grant back in 2017 that was in federal government funded, and it was on payment for agricultural ecosystem services. And we convened a whole bunch of people together, and there were a number of interesting outcomes there. There was a lot of discussion on, yeah, we probably could pay for practices that or performance associated with practices that impact water quality, especially P. Nobody was particularly keen on carbon, but it's against this context that there's belief out there that a small change at the farm level will have a big impact at scale and be significant about things we care about, improving water quality, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, whatever. And so this carbon has really driven the need to quantify. And USDA was really clear at that point. They want to pay for performance, not for practice. And the crediting, conversations and lingo really focus on quantities and magnitudes. And so back to Indiana's nutrient reduction strategy. We wanted to do a rigorous synthesis to underpin the Indiana strategy. Everybody wants to do that. We were looking at modeling it on Iowa's. We wanted to be able to say the percent reduction in flow-weighted concentrations and therefore loads in drainfalls. And the challenges were that a lot of these studies are done at the type of facility that Matt Helmers runs or I run, where you're trying to make these measurements of drain flow volumes and nitrate concentrations year in, year out, and say what the impact of a treatment is. And this is pretty challenging to do. And in Iowa's strategy, if you look at the percent reductions associated with reducing your nitrogen application, the estimate is 10% with perhaps a little bit of yield loss, but there's no variation given in this plan, or at least there wasn't. And that's because there's so much variability. We don't know or we didn't know what the uncertainty was. And these are actually the same data that I believe Iowa State was using and Katie started to use. And this just gives you what the data from a bunch of different studies look like when you're trying to look at what's happening with reducing your N rate from some amount to a recommended amount, or maybe even lower than recommended. What benefit will you get? And if you actually just sort of lump all this together in a fairly, in a way that we would typically lump it together with these are means of replicated studies here, or treatment in a replicated study. And so even that dot has variation around it. The problem is there's really no relationship here. You can draw a line, that blue line, and say, well, it goes from this to this, but statistically, there's no relationship. This is a classic example of a big cloud. So the solution is to account for what's making the studies and the years vary from each other, to be able to look at what the variability associated with the one factor we care about, which is rate, and to quantify that with some certainty. And so there are a few intrinsic problems with trying to do this for a region or even a state. if you look at the recommended N rates, and here I was looking at the Iowa N rate calculator, which I gather is being or has been phased out, but certainly the data still hold for us in Indiana, where we will have different, where's my pointer go? There we go. We will have different recommendations for corn soy rotation. We don't actually have any for continuous maize, depending on the location, which reflects soil types. And this is generally true. Here's Illinois. So you've got the same rate isn't the economically optimum in every region of every state. And then there's the underlying notion that there's a profitability, there's a range around this that's considered acceptable for loss. And the graph, I'm sure everybody's seen this, where you're looking at the fertilizer rate as a function, the cost of the returns versus the fertilizer rates, and this is the cost of the fertilizer that goes up as you increase rate. Here's your yield, which plateaus, so that's your gross return, but you've got to subtract out your nitrogen costs. But this is a profitability, not necessarily, this is a no cost, no concerns about the environment, no costs associated with environmental degradation. And in general, there's enough sort of information out there that suggests you're always going to have some loss in a cropping system. I just drew this in, don't think it means much of anything. But that in general, once you get above where the yield plateau is, well, you're certainly not taking any more off. And that's when your losses, whether they're emissions or water quality, are going to increase. So another problem is that you would like this to have, sort of representation of the studies that are scattered across the regions, but the different studies themselves have different N rate treatments or different increments. And so trying to think about how to put this all together, initially we started with just lumping various N rates into categories. So our group of scientists generally agreed that we could lump them into a none, a very low, which a number of studies have very low. And here I'm giving the rates in kg per hectare, but anywhere from this would be probably primarily a starter application to something maybe a little bit more than that, a low rate of something. And right now I was just thinking about pre-plant N applications because that's sort of the foundational one off of which we make or at planting our baseline NREX. And then, you can identify a low, and then we agreed to identify an economically optimum rate that was low, which is sort of reflective of Minnesota, maybe, and Iowa, which is at lower rates. Not so much Iowa, well, I don't know. And then an EONR, an economically optimum rate that was a bit higher. And then we had, then there are some high rates in the various studies I could look at, and some very high rates. And so I added a bit more data because this allowed us to add some data to this from our own studies, which don't have very many N rates, which was why we weren't included in the first place. But I added some, and you can see the different color coding for the studies. And I did end up excluding manure because we didn't know what the actual N applied was in that manure. We included those studies like mine, which didn't have many N rates. They just had maybe 2 or 3. And if this is just looking at the flow weighted concentrations, and again, you can get a relationship, and typically with concentrations, it's better than with loads. And concentrations have been the focus of how we want to use nutrient reduction strategies, and we could talk about why that works out that way. But anyway, gives you an idea of what's getting exported. Loads can be much messier. And you can see here that this, if you just fit a simple curve to this, and or nothing more than a straight line really fits here because of how the data are distributed, you end up with about 1 ppm when change in nitrate leaching concentration when you're going from very high to the economic optimum. And somehow that just doesn't seem right. So the solution, or one possible solution we decided to look into, and this is where I don't want to bore you, but I'm going to go into the details, but you could just think magic happens. So this is really based on the transitive property, which you learn in high school, but when we start talking statistics, it doesn't seem to be anything we want to embrace. We always have to compare this directly to that before we want to say anything. But the transitive property, if you recall that, x equals y and y equals z, then x equals z if that's true. And then if you remember your algebra, I'm sorry, a plus b equals c, and then if c is equal to 3 times b, then a plus b is going to equal to 3b, and therefore a is going to be twice b. So in other words, if A is a little bit bigger than B and B is a little bit bigger than C, then A should be a lot bigger than C. And that's what we're doing with the network meta-analysis. It takes into account the variation within a study, which I'm not really going to talk about, but every mean, every one of those dots around it has a variation. Sometimes it's big, sometimes it's smaller. And you can go into studies. I'm not going to tell you, the way you do this is you go read papers and you fish out the information and you try to get both the means and the variances. And the only thing that's not really useful is if all you get is a non-significant. And then network just estimates the mean difference with a confidence interval, and it allows you to combine studies that have at least one common treatment. And so given that we put things in categories, now all of our studies had at least one common treatment. And so this is just a visualization of the different comparisons, and you can see that the bars show the number of comparisons that are directly made between two categories amongst all the studies and years of data I was looking at. So if you look at comparing very high to high, there were only 4 studies, but there are 17 studies that look at comparing very high to that economically optimum lower rate. And so the thickness here just gives the relative strength of the direct comparisons. And what we're really interested here is this area. Oops, sorry about that. There we go. Down here where we're looking at very high to the economically optimum high, or maybe down to the low. But we're going to use the information about all the other relationships to trying to strengthen these relationships where we don't, or these estimates where we don't have much information. So I'm going to show you a bunch of graphs that look like this. Here, you're not seeing the economically optimum high rate because everything is being compared to it. So this is just your change in nitrate concentration in parts per million. And so the very high has 4 parts per million more, and on average across all these studies, and this is averaging across continuous corn and corn soy rotations, and that you see here the confidence interval. And then just a reminder of what these categories are. But you are seeing a bigger decrease. So remember, it was 1 when we were just fitting a straight regression line, and you're saying, okay, it's 4 parts per million, and it is significantly different. And going from high is 1.5 parts per million. And so you can get these estimates because basically you're cleaning up the noise that is restricting you from seeing the effect you really want to see. So these were the regression values when we were looking at just that straight fit. And so we're able to see that there is, in fact, a bigger reduction happening when we take out all the other effects. There's a lot of study to study very heterogeneity. That's true. Sometimes the estimates of the direct and the indirect. So indirect is what if you had no direct comparison, it's what what the model is estimating would be the difference. You have no A to C comparison at all. And the direct is if you have a direct, and you can look at whether or not they're the same, and sometimes they're not. And this is probably about how we categorize studies, which is a bit unfortunate. But then just to give you a quick few additional snapshot, does rotation matter? Well, here's continuous corn. Unfortunately, there weren't many site years of data, so we don't have that much to go on when we're looking at concentration changes, but going from very high down to the economically optimum rate would be, a decrease of 5 parts per million. If you're just going part way from a very high to high, maybe 3.7. Here's corn soy. 2 points, not quite as much change, going from very high down to high, but still there nonetheless. And again, this issue, direct versus indirect, which says I need to add more studies, and there is more data. There are more studies out there to add, and I've been trying to do it. But it's a question of pulling more information out of various places, and I haven't moved too much further than when Matt first saw me present. What about load? Here's the difference in kg per hectare, so roughly equivalent to pounds per acre. When you go, this is combining everything from very high down to the economic optimum. If you're just going from high, not so much. Again, maybe an issue with the distribution of the actual observations. We've got 199 and 202, which were at the bottom. We needed some 215s and some 220s and that kind of things. But you have fewer studies to look at overall because not everybody estimates load because either they've got equipment problems or there was no difference in them, and so they didn't report them, or they reported them and just said no difference, which means I can't really use them statistically. So that's a bit of a challenge. And then there's some loads that are reported without a variance estimate, and again, that's a bit of an issue. And I talked to my statistics friends. We're trying a few things, but again, you're guesstimating when you're doing that. What about yields? What do the yields look like? Well, in the studies that we had, and here I'm going to add another caveat. These were studies that were not done within the last decade. I'm adding those now. I'm adding data from that now. But these older studies show that, okay, so this is kg per hectare. You're at very high and high. You've got virtually the same yield. So this is just the same thing. It's just the percent. So 5 to 6% higher yields at very high and high N rates across cropping systems. And so just a couple notes. I'm showing this because initially we weren't considering nutrient reduction, but if you're yield reductions, if you're considering doing something to change the nitrate concentration and it's got a yield penalty, you better be prepared to do something about that, even if it only happens infrequently. And then this just looks at the same thing with continuous corn, percent yield reductions. And then larger, interestingly, with the corn soybean rotations, which suggests maybe the economically optimum is actually the high, and we should only be looking. Oh, that's very high. Oops, it switched. So there is some question. Didn't catch that. There is some question about which which rate, and revisiting the rate categories may be an important thing to do. So we had missing data with continuous corn. The very high and high are not different from each other, but they are different from the economically optimum high rate. So again, thinking about why did that happen? I guess my final thoughts on this are, this is looking at concentration percent reductions, same thing you've already looked at. And again, same way of calculating it. It's not really, I think it's not really, don't worry about this 100% how we calculated these. It's a pretty standard way. But I think if I replot it this way, this gives you the change, the percent change in yields on the blue line, and then you've got some confidence intervals around that. And the percent change in nitrate concentration when you're going all the way down here, so you can see the full curve here. And you know, someplace in here, you're not trading off much yield for a pretty impactful change in water quality. And it's quantifiable on average, and it's meaningful. It's a little bit higher than the estimate, I think, than that Matt may have in, or was initially in, Iowa's nutrient reduction strategy. I think the thing we need to think about is how do you deal with that risk, as well as whether the older numbers, you know, updating it changes how we categorize things, changes how we think about things. There are many, this is just a summary of what I've said. When you go from very high to high, you go down 4 ppm, you're going down 9 kg per hectare. That's impactful. Overall, you've got an issue with some of the relative yields. There are other things that I'm doing to look at it, and I'm adding more data. I'm also looking at agronomic efficiencies, adjusting those categories by site or state-specific RECs, or even by regions, and thinking about the relative yields, finding more data, and then actually applying to more questions. And I just threw this last slide in for kicks, because it's hot off the press. We have just completed a study comparing Centuro to, you know, we added, what we did was 3 years ago, 4 years ago, we added Centuro to an existing treatment of a corn soy rotation. And what we have to compare it to is a stewardship treatment and continuous corn at a 180 pounds per acre. So our corn soy is at 160. We don't have a direct comparison of with without Centuro, but what we can do is we can compare it to the previous 10 years of data where we had that. And then we also had an aggressive cover crop low end treatment in there. That's the corn, soy, rye. And this is the N2O emission differences. And what you see is, well, we're not really seeing, when we compare the with and without Centuro with the exact same N rate, not seeing much difference there. We are seeing a trend, or it is significant at the P.06 level in leaching when you compare corn soy with and without Centuro at 160 pounds N per acre. That's total with the pre-plant 140 and sidedress. And then the yields, maybe a little bit of trend towards an increased yield with Centuro, but it's not significant yet. So that's the kind of thing we're doing to try to untangle these messy data sets. And that's what I have to cover.
Okay. Thanks, Sylvie. And yeah, it's great to, you know, all of us have collected various data sets. So it's kind of exciting to see things combined and looking at it that way. So, okay, if you watch this webinar live and are in need of or wanting to earn a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW, at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today. with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Again, alenaw@iastate.edu. Let's the next slide. If you watch this webinar live and are willing to fill out a voluntary demographic survey, we'd greatly appreciate it. Only one survey response is needed for all 2025 webinars. So if you've done that, thank you so very much. If you're willing to do it, we'd greatly appreciate it. And you can scan that QR code or go to iowalearningfarms.org/survey. Next slide, I think will be a plug. Yes, we're going to talk, we're going to hear from Ross Evelsizer, who's with the Natural Resources. He's a Natural Resources Project Director at the Northeast Iowa RC&D. He's going to talk about a project he's been involved with a number of folks throughout Iowa, looking at assessing the flood reduction benefits of relay intercropping practices in Iowa. So please put that on your calendar for noon next Wednesday to tune in. Let's go to the next slide. Should be okay. If you know somebody that could benefit from watching this webinar, those are all archived. iowalearningfarms.org/webinars, or there's a YouTube channel just for the webinars. All our previous webinars are archived there as well. So go watch to your heart's content. I think that might be the end of the slide, Sylvie. Okay, so we did get a few questions that have come in already. I think you talked about this one a little bit, but kind of maybe amplify or talk a little more about why you chose to use concentration rather than load. I think some of it was just because of what was reported, but anything you want to add to that?
We are looking at load where we have the data. The way I understand Jane and others talking about the concentration, the flow weighted concentrations versus loads, is that they're going to be using at a larger scale. They want to know the flow weighted concentration reductions, and they're going to be using other data sources to make estimates at watershed scales for potential load reductions. So that's and we have more data, but we are looking at load, and if we can quantify the load, we'll quantify the load. I think it always has to go with this caveat that we have to have the loads in the first place. There are more problems with loads from an experimentalist perspective, because that equipment you're trying to collect monitor flow volumes continuously, and that's just a hassle.
Yeah, and the variability that comes up with the drainage that might be due to soil heterogeneity.
Yes,
and so
absolutely.
Forth factored in. Yeah. Okay. Another one. Can you plot relative yield versus N mass loss using your method to get an alternative insight into N export per bushel?
Yes. I mean, those are things that can all be calculated and then basically run through the same sort of analysis. I should say initially when I was starting to do this, when we were having a discussion about it, I was like, yeah, I'm going to extract yields get all the yield information. And the science team was like, no, we just want to know, we want to know what the impact on water quality is. And I'm like, well, what if there's also an impact on yield? Shouldn't we be looking at that? And so then when I went through the pain and suffering of getting all the yield information as well, there's like, oh yeah, we should be looking at that.
There's one. Did these studies consider split application?
So no, we specifically, I mean, all of those differences can be, you can do those kinds of things. You can add them in. This was just me, myself, and I, and actually most of the data that I extracted, and it's not, it hurts your head unless you've done this a lot. Although my stats friend colleague tells me that ChatGPT is actually getting really good it doesn't get it always right at extracting. If you give it the information that's provided in a paper, if it's the LSD, if it's the p-value, it will give you an estimate of the variance in the study that you need for these analyses. If not, the way we report things, there are about 9 different ways to back calculate that variance based on what's actually reported in the paper. And it's kind of a pain. So, yeah, I did this really as a proof of concept that it would untangle stuff and that this would be a viable approach. We just need to now expand the effort.
Okay. Yes, that kind of it leads into the next question. One individual wondered if the data had been published because they were looking to dive deeper into it later. So I don't think it has, but it's something that will hopefully be published in some form, right?
Yes, so
Yeah.
so the data all come from except one the data that I used thus far all come from published studies already that are out there. The data the extracted information variance, that sitteth on the cloud, attached to my computer. It's in a secure location, but I haven't published it. But I am a big proponent of publishing data, and when I get this a bit further along, yeah, it'll all go because I believe in enabling further efforts beyond my own on this.
Yeah. Okay, here's just a compliment. This person indicated you and others who do meta-analysis earn your place in the next world. I appreciated the work. So, but there was a question. What questions have come to you after looking at your data?
Well, I think once people get sort of beyond understanding what it is, I think there's always questions that come up about the other loss mechanisms, right? And so it's like, well, could you add N2O emission data to this? Only I mean, you could do this for N2O emissions. Can you combine all three loss or removal N2O? Well, then you need to have studies that actually do most of those things. And so that is a bit of a challenge. You can make some inferences statistically, and I'm actually reassured by, Bruce, my statistical colleagues on this paper. He told me yesterday that there's a huge effort now amongst the regional applied statisticians, the NC apply the regional. I think they're an NC group, but they're nationwide. They're applied statisticians that are getting together to develop methodologies for more routine use, because these packages, they're in R. You can trick SAS into doing this. There are a bunch of different software packages that are out there that allow you to do this, but the documentation on them is awful. What other pieces of information do I wish I had? Going back and extracting things like the when and where of precip is precip. I can do that because I know where the locations are, but some don't report the precip data, and I don't know, for flow volumes, that would, in theory, the precip would be helpful as a key variable. There are a lot of interesting things you can do with knowledge. I think the other, when we think about total N balance, and what always comes up with N rate is, okay, at what point do we, what N rates are needed to maintain soil health? right? So if you run forever and ever without fertilizer, your soil organic matter will eventually go down. The Illinois Moro plots prove that. Some of these long-term plots, it takes a while to see that change, but when you are applying in, you're always putting on some into some of the applied N will go into the organic matter pool and be cycled. I think there's important things we need to understand about soybeans' role in leaching and in N loss, because it certainly fixes N. It's a contributor and it leaves residue on the field. What does that look like? There's been a fair bit of debate on that. But I think that the main thing that would be really nice to have would be the data sets.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a couple questions somewhat related, kind of thinking about this, for farmers, being a little bit on the high side in N, if they're, the implications of being on the low side of what's needed could be a pretty, more of a steep drop off in the yield response. So how do we further the conversation around risk and any policies about managing that risk of under fertilization?
Yeah. So I mean, this is going to be, if we're serious about this, we're going to consider this because depending on how you fit your economic optimum, there's always going to be a year when it maybe a little bit more and might have gotten a little bit more yield because there's uncertainty around those magic curves. And I think what I hear going on now, and there's several entities who have become involved, like NRCS, and we need to understand the loss risk better, and then acknowledge that there's potentially a loss risk if we set rates at environmental stewardship goals as part of the process of identifying what's a recommended N rate. We say, oh, well, there's an environmental outcome that we have to consider. Then we need to think about how that is dealt with, because obviously nobody's going to do it.
Yeah.
And, there's also been, I think, a renewed discussion on 4Rs in general, because the way the conversation has gone, I don't think it's the way that it was initially intended to go on 4Rs. But right now, when you hear people talking about 4Rs, they're sort of talking about, well, I don't really want to reduce rate. So maybe if I just use this other product, then I meet that goal. And I think that what gets lost there is that placement, source, and timing are all pathways to reduce rate.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
are more effective than
Yeah.
others. But if you don't look at a reduced rate in conjunction with the other strategies, you're kind of missing the point or the opportunity to have an environmental benefit, or to get the full system level benefit, whether that's environmental, whether it's completely reducing risk more. And unfortunately, there are perhaps fewer studies than we would like out there where we look at some of these others and we say, okay, I'm going to take the same rate I would have applied. I'm going to take the rate I would have applied pre-plant, and I'm going to apply it in some other more efficient way relative to the three rest of the R's at 90% of the rate.
Instead, maybe another question, maybe our last one in the interest of time, is instead of just rate, should studies attempt to consider N availability, meaning residual N plus applied N?
In some cases, there is information there to consider that. Other places, there isn't. When you're looking at, if you have input and output But, um, residual soil N is always just going to be a snapshot in time. If you're not doing a whole profile residual soil N, you don't know what's kind of there to lose between this season and the next. And so, and that's not a trivial exercise. I'm always mindful of how are we going to, like, how's this going to be implemented practically at scale?
Yeah.
And in the end, what we care about is in terms of environmental impacts, is the loss factors. What the farmer cares about is the yield. And whether the soil has residual nitrate in it and the bugs get happy and it gets used in and incorporated into soil organic matter or gets lost is an interesting scientific question, but maybe not as important as we'd like to think when it comes to trying to achieve the goals at scale.
Okay. Great. Great, Sylvie. Thank you so much for excellent presentation, giving us a lot to think about. And I think it's, there are a number of people that are looking forward to any additional information you provide in the future on this. So it's awesome. Thank you for saying yes to my, like arm twisting to come on and give the webinar. So,
I actually, this is one of my pet projects that I really like. But it's not the one that seems to nip at my heels every day when I walk in the door, unfortunately.
All right.
If I could make this one nip at my heels more, then I would, be fine ignoring everything else and getting on with this.